For those of you who don't know me, I am the tech lead on the Generate side of things. It's nice to be here. Just two quick things before I pass it over to Johnny for review of everything. Here in a short little while, we will have a slide that has a QR code, and I think we'll also put the link in the chat. We use this information. It's just a short questionnaire. It takes probably less than 2 minutes to complete. We do use the information to edit or tweak or add or, delete any items from these office hours. So it is really helpful. We do use the evaluation data. So if you have a few minutes to complete it, that would be great. We really appreciate it. And then I think most of you already know this. I think most of you have been on these calls, but they're really meant to be interactive and to help answer questions or concerns or whatever you have. So don't hesitate to unmute yourself. You don't have to wait for Johnny or whoever to stop speaking in order to ask a question. You should all have access to unmute yourselves. If you don't want to unmute and you want to throw something in the chat, we will be monitoring the chat as well. So again, however you want to communicate, if you want, don't hesitate to do so. Any questions or concerns before we kick off? Okay. Okay, so this is our agenda for the next hour. We will do, Johnny's going to review changes that have been included in the 13.2 release. We will review some documentation file sharing updates. Johnny will also do a quick preview of what to expect for 13.3. We'll review the calendar, and then, like I said a minute ago, our QR code for the feedback survey. We have open discussion there at the end, but again, don't hesitate to unmute or throw something in the chat if you want to chat about anything or you have any specific questions. Johnny?
So hello everybody. Johnny Cunningham. I am an ETL developer and a developer of the Generate project as well. That's Tommy. If you haven't met him before, I apologize. I've tried to toss him off the desk a couple times and he won't go away. As soon as he hears me talking, he shows up. So he's better to look at than me anyway. So we can jump right into it because we got a fair amount of stuff to go through today. So like Liz said, if there are any questions, you can put them in the chat. I don't monitor the chat, but they do because it's I would easily get confused. Or you can come off mute and ask a question. So at any point. So really quickly, going through the set of changes, we break these down by the IDEA reports and then the non-IDEA reports, and then we go through other changes in Generate. So for the IDEA specific reports, we only have one set of changes going in. They are for discipline that was just submitted in February, but it was something we found when we were working through that with states. The zero count logic was not correctly removing schools or LEAs, in this case LEAs, because that the discipline files aren't reported on a school level, but schools or LEAs, it was impacting both. That were reported federally if that was set to no. Right. So if you're not familiar with that, Generate has a field associated with every district and every school where you can set whether or not that district or school should be included in your federal reporting. That way, if you want to load up your data warehouse with all of your organizations, even the ones that are not federally reported, you can do that because you can flag them. The logic was missing in the zero count part to remove the not federally reported for states that might use those. So that was the change for discipline. And again, that was for the files that were just submitted in February, but now it is part of the Generate core. So that's it for the IDEA reports. Non-IDEA, we've got quite a bit to go through for this one. Okay, so for directory, We had some issues with the metadata. We had a couple of states, I think, that are on today that experienced this. Partway through the year, it looks like the metadata update had some invalid references in it. And so when you created a submission file for directory, there were columns that the data wasn't populating. It was the address columns. And then I think there were one or two others. I can't remember specifically, but there was one or two other columns, and it was a metadata issue. We updated the metadata and then got that resolved. Another thing that the metadata was impacting was if you went to the reports page, you normally, if you're familiar with that, if you're somebody that uses the Generate UI, when you go to the reports page, it has buttons for the different levels that specific report is available at. So in this case, for directory SEA, LEA, school, so those three buttons show up, and that's how you can switch between those three levels. It was showing SEA, but not showing the other two, I believe was the issue. But it was preventing the buttons from showing correctly, again, related to the metadata. So that was resolved with the metadata update. 226. This one is, we had a problem with the zero counts. So really quickly, for a little bit of context, we are developing, if you're not familiar with it yet, if depending on how deep you are into the files, how much time you've spent in Generate up to this point, we are developing a new report migration process that is going to replace the current one that produces most of the files, because that heavily uses dynamic SQL, which is a little more difficult to troubleshoot when you're actually trying to follow your data through and you're trying to look at like how students are moving through the different layers of the migration. Dynamic SQL is a little more difficult to actually look at and determine what it's doing. So we have a new process that we're going to. There's a handful of files that are using that new process already. 226 is one of those. The zero count logic for the new process was not creating the appropriate zero counts, so we worked on that. For 226, it also impacted 222, 223. It would have also impacted 218, 19, 20, and 21, but I don't think there's any states actually working on those actively yet. So again, that only impacted files that were going through that new process, which is only a handful of files, and those are those I'm saying newer, the ones that were added in the last couple of years. And then for staff 67, we were working on file 67 with states, and we needed a column. In this case, we named it Title III Language Instruction Indicator, because for that file, it is a count of teachers that taught in a Title III language instruction program. And we did not have a way to capture that piece of data in order to do the rest of the file. So we added that column, and then of course added the appropriate pass-through code for all of the migrations to get that data to go through. So now 67 is a file that we can do and Generate. 118 was, so we had previously, we had added some deduplication logic to 118 as we were working with the state. And I think what it was doing was too targeted. So there were some states that said, well, that doesn't match the way we do homeless. So we scaled back some of that deduplication, took it to match basically the file specification as best we could. And so that's what that is. We've rolled back some of that deduplication logic. And what we have in there now matches the language of the file specification. So that one should be good. I think we can go to the next page. There's a couple of pages of these. 195. We worked with Nevada on this file, so they were piloting this file. And as they were working through the file, they realized, okay, there's some things that the file specification requires. There is some filtering that is required that the logic at that point did not have. So we worked on that in conjunction with Nevada as we were working on that, and added some additional logic because there is language in the file specification that it should only include students that are K through 12 and ungraded, just those grade levels. And the current filtering logic, or the filtering logic at that point, did not have that. So like in their case, they had some PK students in their data set, and those students were being passed through and they shouldn't have. So we added that additional filtering and logic. So it now passes grade level through and then uses it as a filter at the end. High school graduate post-secondary enrollment is a file we worked on. This is, again, a new file. Really quickly, side note, for those of you that are not aware, we have a project called SCDU. It's the Scalable Data Use Project, SCDU. And it's a group of states that have gotten together that are working on some of the files that have not been submitted through Generate previously. And so I want to give a shout out to that group, and I want to give a shout out to a couple of states that are also doing some of this work, because a lot of what you're seeing here when I say, okay, this is a new file specification that's available, or we did this now, this one migrates, that's where that work is coming from. Those states took on those files. As they run into issues, like we get together and work on those things, and they develop, potential updates to the code. And then we get to a point where we feel comfortable saying, okay, I think we've gotten this pretty good. It will now become part of the core Generate code, which is what we have here. We have several files we're adding in this release of Generate. 160 is one of those. Mississippi worked on this one. And so we added the code to migrate 160 correctly with any additions to, in some cases, like I mentioned with the other file, we realize, there's an additional element that's required, or there's some piece of data that we have to be able to capture that our staging environment currently doesn't. And so that was the case with 160. I think all I ended up putting here, and I apologize, this was a poor bullet for what we did here. 160 we did put in, I think, in 13.1, but we added some additional refining logic in this release and made that code work better. It performs better now, but it was one that I think was released in 13.1. Okay, so 86 and 163, these are two different things, but they're both in the discipline set of files. So for 86, the thing that we saw here was the file specification has some language that's a little bit contradictory. The actual purpose of the file specification says it's an unduplicated number of students who were involved in a firearms incident, right? And then down in the language of the file specification, it says, there's a little asterisk comment that says, on the rare occasion that a student is included or is involved in more than one firearm incident, include them both times, which contradicts the unduplicated number, right? So we had originally, the code that Generate was using was doing the unduplicated number. So in the case that you had a student who was involved in two separate incidents, it was excluding one of them. And so we had to refine that logic, and now it does a combination of incident and identifier and student, because we also realized that as you go through it, see, originally it was using incident identifier as the qualifier to say, okay, we're going to just look at incidents and that's how we're going to include them. But then we realized as we were doing this work and we had to sort of handle that file specification language, that we needed to combine incident identifier and the student identifier, because you could have one incident that has multiple students. So just using one or the other wasn't appropriate. So the two of them together actually satisfies the requirement of file specification, and it can handle both. It can give you an unduplicated number if that's appropriate, or it can include a student more than once if that's appropriate based on the data that's provided. And then for 163, there was an issue with the UI. When you went to the school level file, it wasn't actually showing the school ID. That was just a UI issue, not a like a problem with the data that was flowing through, but we corrected that in the UI. And then Title One, so 134, 222, I think I mentioned 222 earlier when we were talking about 226. That's the second bullet. It's the same thing. We corrected the zero counts. And then for 134, this was in our work with New Mexico. This is another file that was a pilot file. And as they were working on 134 and we were actually, trying to get that file submittable, we realized like it was not correctly taking the age grades and putting them into the appropriate under 3 to 5, not K. So we refined that and got that working. I think there's one more page of these. That's why I said there's quite a few of these. Okay, so 45, 116. These are also pilot files that we worked on. So we completed, so I want to qualify this when I say it just so everybody's aware of kind of where we're at with these. So what I put here is I said completed the migration logic. So with that, what we mean is you can put data in to generate, it will migrate it successfully, and you will have data in the report table that is appropriate based on the code that we have. Like as more states start testing this, obviously that's when we like, if a state says, well, the way we have typically done this, this is what we come up with, and that's how we sometimes end up refining the generate logic. But what I mean here is we were able to successfully migrate the data all the way through into the report table. There could still be a UI issue or maybe something with the submission file that we are still working on, but we got the process complete to be able to migrate data into the report table so that you can actually successfully migrate these files, review counts in the report table, and we are working on the UI and submission files if there are any issues there. So we got both of those two done. Those are also new files. 141 is similar to the one that I mentioned. I think it was on the first page of these files. I don't remember which file. There was a similar issue where it was not removing non-reportable schools. So that logic to remove those wasn't there at the very end when it was doing the aggregations. So we added that to the filtering so that it's appropriate. Graduates completers 40 is another one of those SCIID files that we worked on in conjunction with the states. And again, completed the migration logic so you can successfully put data into the staging environment. It will migrate successfully into the report table. We may still have UI or file submission things that we have to review and work on, but you can successfully migrate data with those. I think that's all for the non-IDEA. We don't normally stop, but I'm going to say really quick because we covered a lot of stuff in there and I want to make sure everybody's comfortable. Does anybody have any questions about any of that or the one set of IDEA changes? Because I sort of zipped through those pretty quick. I want to make sure that's clear or you're comfortable with what we changed or what some of that means if there was anything unclear. Okay. And you can always ask a question at any point, if something pops into your head. So for the user interface, the changes for this release, we had an issue with the metadata process. So if you're not familiar with the UI, we added it, I want to say 2 or 3 versions ago. You can actually get the metadata on demand now. So there's an API that connects, pulls the metadata down, distributes it into the tables. That process was not showing the school year 2026. So you couldn't pull the newest set of metadata. Figured he'd be back at some point. We corrected that issue. So 2026 is now available when you upgrade to 13.2. I would suggest that's probably one of the first things you'd want to do is go ahead and run the metadata for 2026. And then just be aware, this is just a feature of the way it connects to the API and all that. When you first go to the page, it can sometimes take 5-10 seconds or so for that list to appear. Because when you go to the page, it has to connect through the API, sorry. Connect through the API, it connects to the database where it's going to pull all that from. And it looks at the school years that are available, does some logic, and then returns with the appropriate list. So that can take 5 to 10 seconds. Just, give it a second. And then once you select 2026 and go to apply the metadata, I think there's a message on the screen that says the system might be unavailable for 30 minutes or so. It typically does not take 30 minutes to apply the metadata, but it can take 10, 15, 20 minutes. So don't be surprised. It's not an immediate process because it has to go out, pull the entire file down, and then it goes through that file and, pulls out the appropriate data and distributes it into the generate table. So that process can take a little while. I would say if you do run into a problem where it has not completed in 30 minutes or so, definitely reach out, let us know. There are configuration things. There is generate documentation on the configuration options to get that automated metadata process to work. So I would suggest review those, make sure that, you have all that set of changes in. And I meant to have a reference in here, I apologize, but it's in the generate documentation. And we're going to look at that in a minute, the generate documentation, but yeah, sorry. So that's the metadata update. For user accessibility, we've been working, Maine was doing their certification process, and part of that was user accessibility. So we really appreciate the work that they did. They reviewed the site, sent us what their tool found. We have an internal tool that we use that we were using at the same time as well. So between those two, we've identified issues within Generate, and we've been correcting those over the last 2 or 3 releases. We've been adding more accessibility changes. So this one, there were a couple of specific things that we changed. And there will probably be more to come because I don't think we've resolved all of the issues that our tool has found. I think we've satisfied what the main tool found, but I've got to verify that as well. But we are adding more accessibility updates as we come across those. Okay, so general changes, this is where we'll spend a little bit of time. The big one, we implemented the CEDS version 13 data warehouse changes. And this was typically, we would do this on our numbered release. So I mean like the .0 release. We were behind on this one. This was a generate issue. CEDS released that set of changes a little late, but that wasn't the problem. It was like us getting these changes integrated into generate. That's why it's coming out in .2 instead of the .0. But we do have the the CEDS version 13 data warehouse changes are now implemented into generate. And for those, I try to say this as often as I can, but I just to make sure there's no confusion. Generate leverages the CEDS data warehouse. There isn't a generate version of the data warehouse. So what we were implementing is the CEDS version 13 data warehouse. We don't make changes to it. We suggest changes to it just like the rest of the community does if we come across something that's missing. But I just wanted to make that point clear, right? This is not a version of, this is the actual version 13 data warehouse that's out there available for anybody to pull down. The big changes that I would mention here, and one of those is below, but we're going to talk about that one separately. There's a couple of there were a few dimension tables that generate uses that were modified. So we had to make some changes to the migration code. They did not impact like the staging environment or how you're going to feed data into Generate. But if you are one of the people like the implementers, developers, that actually migrates data and sort of validates that data through the process, you may see some new things that, like, if you're really comfortable with some of the old dimensions, that a few of those changed. Not significantly, but there's some minor changes. One of the things that was a pretty big change, but only to us that deal with the code, was in the junk dimensions, and I'm going to go a little deep into the SQL stuff now, so I hope I don't like bore the folks that don't do SQL. In those tables, there were columns that were null, right? Like if that particular column or whatever, didn't need to have data in it, it was null. Or we have what we call a missing row that we add to the top of every dimension. So the ID is -1, and basically all of the columns are empty. And that's how we can say, like, we can still join to that dimension even if no data was passed in. That's how we do that, is having that missing row. Well, all of those individual columns, like I said, they were empty. They were previously set to null, but that is not the appropriate way to handle dimension tables in a database model. That you shouldn't have null columns. So those columns are now the empty string. So again, to people that don't do SQL, that probably doesn't mean anything. But for those of you that do, that work with it, just be aware of that. Those dimensions now, where they may have had a null column before, now have an empty string instead of null. So if you have any existing SQL scripts or something where you were looking for and column equals null or column is null, you'll just have to be aware that you might have to update some of those. And again, that was a CEDS change, not Generate, but because we use the data warehouse, we have to, update to match. Okay, so the next thing is labeled migrations, but the first thing is a CEDS version 13 change. We had one meeting about this previously, maybe a month ago. It's the dim people current table. I'm going to go into a little bit of explanation of this table, and certainly if anybody has questions, ask questions. And I'm going to give a little bit of context for those of you that may not be aware of this. If you were not involved in some of those previous discussions or the work group that met on the CEDS side, because this was a CEDS change, and then we are implementing it. Definitely benefits Generate. So this is one we've been waiting on. This is good for us. So a little bit of context. There is the dim people table, which holds all of the student and staff information. It is a longitudinal table, which means it has record start and record end dates, right? So as a record comes in for the first time, it's given a record start date of whatever date that record came in, and the end date is null, which means that's the current record. It is open until another record comes in and replaces it. So as that student is migrated a second time for some other file or whatever, we'll just say student. This would also apply to staff. As that comes in, that first record is end dated. The second record now has a start date with no end date, and you just keep building longitudinally. Sorry, tough word. So as it builds those out, right, that table has the student ID, the student's first, middle, and last name, their birth date, and then there's additional information in there which Generate really doesn't use, but there's other columns in there. There's an is active flag to identify the student as an active student or as an active staff member. But that's pretty much all Generate uses. The problem we ran into previously, and this is what we were trying to resolve and what dim people current does for us, is you could have multiple records for a student in 1 year. Right? Because as a student comes in potentially with first name, no middle name, last name, then the second time they're migrated, maybe they come from a different source. Now they have a middle name. Well, that's a different record than what was in there. So now there's a new record with start and end dates. And then a third source potentially brings it in with a middle initial instead of a middle name. Now there's a third record because it's different than the other two. And then when generate was processing whatever file you happen to be working on, it would join back to dim people, but we had to have all of this date logic, right, to make it appropriately grab the right one of those three records. And that complicated the process. There were times where it didn't join to the right record. There were just issues with that. 2 versions ago, I want to say it was in 13, we actually added a temporary table, which was doing what dim people current was ultimately going to do. We knew dim people current was coming, but rather than waiting for it, we're like, okay, we can help alleviate this issue. We put in a code that basically went to dim people, pulled all the records down, eliminated the dates, and then just kept one record for every student. And that's basically what dim people current does. So dim people current has no dates in it, and it stores one record for every student or staff member. It will update with whatever the most recent data comes in as. So again, there's all those other columns in there. If you send in data or names, anything like that, right? If any of that stuff changes, that record in dim people current is just going to update. It doesn't add a new one. It doesn't add a second or a third or a fourth. There's one record. It will have the current version of the student's name and their student ID and birth date and whatever other information is in there. But that simplifies generate tremendously because generate just says, okay, basically is this student ID combination with birth date, because that's what it uses as a key currently to make sure that we have uniqueness. So it basically says, is that combination in the table? Okay, that's the person or that's the student or the staff member we're talking about as we do the rest of this work. So dim people current simplifies that process tremendously. It doesn't really change how you're going to do anything, especially the loading of staging doesn't change at all. So any scripts you have, those are not going to change or don't need to change for dim people current. What that is going to change is if you have any, again, like we've talked about previously, if you've got any stored SQL queries, potentially to query like the fact table, the fact table now has a K-12 student ID, which is what it always had, which relates to dim people. And then it has a K-12 student underscore current ID, which relates to dim people current. So there's an additional column in the fact table. We keep that dim people reference. So you can actually go back and look at the longitudinal data if you want to. What longitudinal record does this connect to? But the current record is the one that Generate is using as far as moving the data through and references. And as your student records come in, I do want to clarify that too. We are still updating dim people as we always were. So dim people will continue to build all of that longitudinal history. It's just that in the generate code, as we are joining and referencing, we use dim people current because one record per student, it simplifies it tremendously. Okay. The others I'm going to go through a little faster. The second one I mentioned in some of the report specific ones, we didn't have the filters for reported federally, so we added that in different places in the report logic. The debug views. So if you're familiar with these, again, we have debug views of the staging environment and the fact table environment so that as you migrate data, let's say child count, for example, as you migrate your child count data, as that data comes into staging, you can look at that view and it translates all of those codes back into English language readable values so that you can see, like, instead of having a race code, or like a code number or whatever, it actually puts the race value so you can see those and you could use that view to, to test your data, look at your data, evaluate what was migrated into staging to make sure it's appropriate, accurate. Then we have the same thing on the fact table. What we uncovered was in some of those fact table views, like there are multiple of those views, child count, discipline, exiting, assessments, that might look at like DIM IDEA statuses, right? So the dimension table for IDEA. And as we were going through those, we realized there was some inconsistencies where one of those might be referring to the EDFACS code from that dimension table, and the other one might be referring to the code from that dimension. It did not impact the performance of that view. It did not impact the data that you were looking at in that respect, but we did want to make those more consistent. So that's what that the third bullet is. We went through all of those, and if there's an EDFACS code available in that dimension, we use that. If there wasn't one, then we referred back to the code. So that's that one. The other one is also in those views. There was a cross join to source system reference data. And what that was causing, and this was all filtered out, so it was not a problem downstream, but for the view itself, it was. There was a cross join to source system reference data. And if you're a state that's been with us for more than one cycle, then you have more than 1 year's worth of mappings. So, sorry, quick context. The source system reference data table is all of the mappings that map your incoming code set values to the appropriate CEDS values. So it's a table of mappings. It maps your incoming race values to the CEDS race values, the disability codes to the CEDS disability codes, and so on. So those are specific to your state. And they can change even from year to year. If you change something on your source side, then you might have new mappings or you might have different mappings. But anyway, that table, it was doing a cross join to that table, which then meant if you had been with us for more than 1 year, it was joining to more than 1 year's worth of those values. And so the result set was pretty large, depending on how many years you had in there. And then it was then filtering all those out later. So that's very inefficient. It was filtering down to the appropriate year, but then filtering those out. So we modified that so it only pulls the appropriate year based on what you're migrating. So now it's much more efficient. So those should run faster. They're more efficient. They don't pull unnecessary data that then has to be filtered later. And then the last one was an issue, I think, that a couple of states, Kentucky identified this, and there was one other state, I believe, possibly Utah, I think, that helped identify this issue. It was in the migration of the dimension DIM LEAs, DIM K-12 schools that was resulting in the state name and state abbreviation being null, which then meant later in the report migration, there were records that wouldn't get migrated. Like the students that should have gone into those schools and those districts weren't migrated because the state name and state abbreviation was missing from the code. We corrected that issue. Yeah, I think that's it. That was a lot. For this one, so that was also a pretty significant set of changes. I know we're getting kind of long here, but does anybody have any questions about any of those? Want any more detail? Make sure I described it well enough that you understand what that was, or maybe what the impact is to you, because most of those things don't have a lot of impact to you. They're sort of under the covers changes, but if you do have any questions. Okay. So this one, I'm going to do the documentation part first, because we've got a group of people that are working on like our Gitbook documentation. So cleaning that up, adding more documentation, translating some of the stuff we had in other formats, and they've been doing a tremendous amount of work. So there's additional documentation that was added for this release for the installation guide that talks about some of the different security stuff. There's that new migration process that I mentioned, report migration stored procedure, that right now is only handling just a few files. We added documentation for that because we are hoping that, you know, as we have time, we're going to transition more reports over to that new way and ultimately at some point down the road, move away from that dynamic SQL process. And then the installation instructions, the connection strings added because they were outdated and we needed to update those. And then, of course, they will have the 13.2 release notes available out there. The big one for this cycle, or for this release, sorry, is file sharing. So I really want to talk about this one. It's a quick one. It's what's on screen. So if you go to the GitHub Generate project, and we've got the links. So when you get the deck, you've got the links down there. One is for our documentation, but the other one is for the GitHub site. Oh, and I've got to change that link. I apologize. We updated the name, so I've got to change that link really quickly. But if you go to the Generate GitHub project, if you go to the master branch and then to docs, we now have the generate file storage location there. And what we're going to use that for is we're trying to find a more efficient way to be able to share anything we need to be able to share that involves files. So the obvious one and what we have up there currently, or what we left in the folder to make it sort of available, is hotfixes. So if we put out a release and then, as we're working with states, we determine there's something that, Generate is not doing appropriately, there's an efficiency we need to add, something along those lines to make something work or work better. And we determine it cannot wait for the next release. This is something that needs to go out now. We usually send out a hotfix. And it typically is a stored procedure file or something that you're just going to replace the existing one with this new one, right? So with Gitbook, we're going to have instructions in there that describe what the hotfix is, what it's addressing, and what steps you need to take to apply it. And then the file itself will be available out at this location. So it's not somebody has to email it and you potentially miss it, right? Or the email list hasn't been updated and it didn't get sent to the person who really needed to see that email. We're trying to eliminate that, trying to make this much more efficient. So they will have this location. We will put the file out there. And then in Gitbook, there will be all of the information you would need about the file, what you need to do, what it's fixing, because there may be a hotfix that doesn't apply to you. If we send a hotfix out for, let's say assessments and you're not doing assessments, it may not be something you need to worry about. And you can just, wait for the next release, which will have that set of fixes in it anyway. That's one purpose for this location. So, sorry, it always makes me laugh. So we will use it for hot fixes. We will also use it for generate releases. So with each release, we create two release packages. One is a new release package, which basically means if you're a state that doesn't have Generate and you're going to install Generate the first time, you would use the new release package. And then we also have an update package. So if you're a state that already has Generate and you're just upgrading from one version to the next, that's a different package, right? Because those things need to operate slightly differently. So those two sets of files will be out here starting with 13.2. So we will have the two packages out here. The other thing we're going to do, we talked about the metadata process, the on-demand metadata process. What happens is Generate pulls the file down and there is a metadata file that we receive. And we are going to take that file and put it out here as well. That way, for any state that runs into problems, either with the API, with security trying to connect to the API or to that server or anything like that, we will have the most recent metadata file out here with instructions on when you would need to use it and how you would use it if you were having issues. Again, that would only be if you're having problems running metadata from the UI. But if you do, we'll have the file out here with instructions. We may also put supplemental things out here, which are a little different than a hotfix, meaning like if we develop a new tool that we think like, oh, hey, states could really benefit from this thing. And we don't necessarily want to wait to put it out in, like for now, we have 13.2, 13.3 is going to come out in May, roughly. And then 14 is going to come out, next year, September, August, September, somewhere around there, September, November. If we don't want to wait for the next release, we may put something out here. And again, there'll be Gitbook documentation on what it is, if it's something you need to apply to the Generate environment, how to do that. So those are the things that we currently are going to use this for. Hot fixes, we will put the release packages out there. We'll put the most current metadata file out there. And if we have any sort of supplemental release, and again, this would be where you would need to like update something in Generate. So a stored procedure or something like that. Those are the 4 things that we are currently going to be using it for. And we are going to start using it with this release. So you'll have the packages out there, because I know there's a couple of states that currently have to do manual upgrades. So those files will now be available. You don't have to reach out and have someone send them to you or whatever. They'll be available. I think that's it for this one. And I will update that file sharing link. But sorry, if you do get this, if you use that link, just leave off the supplemental release. Sorry, Taylor, can you go back one really quick? Sorry. So that file sharing link down there, if you just leave off the word supplemental releases and go to docs, then you'll see generate file storage. That's the current name. And that's the name we're sticking with. So you'll still be able to get to it. The link is still good. It's just that last piece, that last folder name, we changed that folder name. That was it. Thank you, Taylor. Okay, so a preview of 13.3. This is pretty generic, but basically any updates we need to make for the July files. So that would be child count, membership, free and reduced lunch, the staff file 59. So any updates we need to make to that set of files would be included. Again, we will continue to make accessibility improvements, tool enhancements as we come across things that we can add or fix or make a tool better, more useful. Those will be out there. And then validation rules, we have a task internally because there were a few of these and a couple of states came across them, and I want to apologize for that. A couple of states came across this, that like newer states that were working on like directory, for instance, right? And the validation rules were putting, it was flagging columns that were not required for the specific file they were working on. So it was sort of a false positive. We're going to go through and review all of those rules, clean those up, and then add, any missing rules that might be appropriate. I realized too, sorry, you swat me, you doofus. There was one thing I forgot, and I didn't put it in one of the slides. So I'm going to share really quickly. This is just a quality of life improvement. And then Taylor can take it back. So I'm going to look, sorry, because it's over here. You can look at Tommy. In Generate 13.1 and every version before that, there is a set of tables in the DBO schema. So this set of tables, they are the CEDS IDS. Right? Like we use the data warehouse. Generate previously, many versions ago now, used to use the IDS. And so we had the IDS tables in Generate because we migrated data into them. We used the reference tables. We have since removed any reference or use of the IDS, but we just had to have a little bit of time to go back and clean this up. So what this is if you were scrolling because you needed to get to certain tables, you had the app tables, then you had all of these DBO tables, which was part of the IDS, before you got down to the RDS and staging tables, which is, the meat of Generate, basically, right? So with version 13.2, we removed the DBO tables. Again, It's just a quality of life improvement. This does not impact any work that you do. There's no change required on your part. Nothing you have to do. There's no interaction at all, other than the fact that now you don't have to scroll for a mile. I think there were over 900 of those tables in the IDS. So those are now gone in version 13.2. Taylor, you can take the share back. Sorry, that was a quick one, but we were happy to finally get the time to be able to remove those and test it and everything. Okay. I think the last one, oh, sorry, the generate release calendar basically just defines what we have coming up. So the one that we're about to release is 13.2. And that is for, it says May and June because it's the directory files in May, and then it's that one file 35. It's due in June. And I don't remember that one. I think is not due every year, but it's that one odd file that sits out there in June. Then we'll have the release in May, which will support the July files. So we reference that as child count, but obviously membership and that staff file as well. And then we would have the numbered release where we're going to go from the 13 version to 14 in roughly October. So there are asterisks by those two just because, you know, they could change slightly the dates, that sort of thing. But that set of files, this is going to be slightly different than in the past for those of you that have been with us for a while, where we used to have a numbered release sort of in the summer, and then we would have another release in like October and then another one in December. We're combining the numbered release and that first release that we would have in October into one. So that release will have all of our summer development and all the things we typically do, but it will also support that first set of files that are due in the new year. So the 2 submission windows in January, the 2 sets of files that are due in January. And then we'll have a release after that that supports the 2 February. It's just not on here. Go to the next one. I did not leave a lot of time, and I apologize, but there was a lot in here. This is the survey link. Liz mentioned it at the beginning. We'd really appreciate it if you could jump in here and it's a quick survey, because we do use this feedback to try to refine these sessions and make them better, more useful for you and for the broad group, right? Because there's project managers, developers in here. There's lots of different folks, and we'd like to, you know, try to hit everybody's requirements as best we can. But while you're doing that, we now have the last 5 minutes or so, and I can certainly stay on a little longer if necessary. That is just open discussion. You can leave this one up, Taylor, if you don't mind, but I think there's one after this that just says session feedback or something that we don't need to go to that slide. But now it's open. So if anybody has any questions they want to ask about 13.2, it's open mic. And like I said, I know I ran late, but I can stay on a little longer if we get into a good discussion about something or whatever. Came up in the chat, generate file storage folder. No, it actually is available in Ali. Good question. It is available now, and it's called generate file storage. That's why my link is wrong, because we have since changed that name. It's out there. The only thing that's currently in there, we left a couple of the hot fix files in there from previous versions. They're not something you need to apply, but we wanted to have something in there when we referenced the folder, because once we, like for 13.2, we'll clear that. We'll put the release packages out there. We'll put the metadata file out there. And then if at some point between 13.2 and 13.3, we determine there is a hot fix, then it would go out there and we'll start building from there. So the hot fix ones, really quickly, because I didn't cover that, those will go away with a new release. Because if it was a hot fix between 13.1 and 13.2, let's say, right? So it was a hot fix for 13.1, then that code will be implemented in version 13.2. So there would be no reason to apply it after you've gone to the next version. So those hotfix files will go away. You'll see them while they're necessary. When the new version comes out, they'll go away. That's the reason they also have a number on them, just in case there's any confusion or in case we accidentally leave one out there or something like that.
Thank you, Johnny. Since it's an open mic right now, I'm taking advantage out of this. I'm on the CEDS Collaborative Exchange GitHub page right now. In repository, should I choose the generate first? I click on that one and I don't see that folder structure that what you showed us.
If you go to, just make sure in the branch that you're in the master branch.
Yep, I'm in the master.
Master and then docs.
Yes, now I see it. Gotcha. That was my bad.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I apologize, but there is a little bit of navigation to get to that one. And that I think is probably going to be the sticking point for some, because I think when you go there, usually it defaults, or depending on what you were last time, is the develop branch. So
Okay.
if you're in the develop branch, you're not going to see it. So just make sure you switch to master for the purposes of the documentation.
Thank you. And then for the 13.2 installation files, where are you going to post them? Are you going to post them somewhere here?
They'll be in that folder.
In that folder. Okay. Sounds good.
And we'll name them because we're not going to create separate subfolders for those different things like hotfix, but you can see we left the naming structure up for those. The hotfix ones have hotfix in the name of the file. The packages will have something in them like install, whatever. And then if there's a supplemental release, it'll have something that defines it. The metadata file will have metadata in the file name to clearly delineate what each of those is, but they will all be in that one folder.
Sounds good. Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have any questions? I apologize. I sort of ran long with all of that. Didn't leave a lot of time for questions, and again, if you can fill out the survey, we would really appreciate it. It is the top of the hour for those of you that have to drop. Thank you very much for joining today. Hopefully you got what you needed. Looks like
people. So welcome everyone to the Generate 13.2 office hours. My name is Liz Burnett.